Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Challenges to the mDL Ecosystem. This is a Secure Technology Alliance and Identity Council produced webinar. And my name is Randy Vanderhoof, and I'm the Executive Director of the Secure Technology Alliance. If we could advance to the next slide, please. So today's webinar is going to look at the challenges in which the states and industry suppliers will be addressing to enhance the mobile driver's license ecosystem. This is the fourth and final webinar in a series of 4 webinars that have been hosted by the Secure Technology Alliance. Today's webinar is being recorded, and it will be available for playback along with the presentation after the webinar has concluded today. Also, we'll have time at the end for questions. So I encourage our listeners to submit their questions using the user dashboard on your screen in the Q&A box. And I'll return at the end of the presentation to lead the Q&A discussion. And we ask you to submit your questions while the presenters are speaking so that we have time to organize them and alert them to the questions that have come in. Also, we are going to prepare an online knowledge assessment quiz that will be available shortly after today's webinar. We've done this for each of the 4 webinars that we've produced in this series. And participants who attended all 4 webinars and completed the assessments will receive a certificate of participation and discounted registration to any future Secure Technology Alliance paid conference or educational event. We can advance to the next slide, please. So I'll be taking care of the introductions of our webinar content and the panelists today. And prior to the start of the webinar, I'd just like to say a few words about the Secure Technology Alliance and the Identity Council initiative to raise the awareness of and accelerate the adoption of mobile driver's licenses in the United States. So if we could advance to the next slide. For some of you that are not familiar with the Secure Technology Alliance, briefly, the mission of the organization is as a non-for-profit, multi-industry association working to stimulate the understanding, adoption, and widespread application of secure solutions. Now, that takes in a lot of technologies and a lot of business areas, but we provide in a collaborative, member-driven environment education and information about those technologies, such as smart cards, embedded chip technology, and other related hardware and software that can be adopted across many different markets across the United States. That being a very broad mission, if you look on the right side of your screen, you'll see the principal markets and services that we focus our activities around. And many of these, such as access control, authentication, and healthcare, are really the markets where the embodiments of the technology and the applications of mobile driver's licenses most rapidly addresses. And so we're really focusing in on those areas with this new and advancing technology. And so as a cross-industry member-supported organization, we do the following things to educate and stimulate the market by bringing together the stakeholders to collaborate on promoting these secure technologies and addressing the industry challenges and implementing them. We do this through publishing white papers, producing webinars like today, doing workshops and newsletters, position papers, and web content. We also produce conference events and workshops that focus on the specific markets and the technology. We offer education and training and industry certifications to advance the professional development of our industry players. We also provide advanced networking opportunities for professionals to share ideas and knowledge and to gather the market intelligence they need to make best decisions going forward. And we use strong industry communications tools through our public relations and web resources and social media tools in order to get the message out about the work that we're doing in advancing the industry. If we can go to the next slide. So to address the broader market focus for the Secure Technology Alliance, the Alliance's working committees are organized into specific industry and technology verticals to address the specific ways that consumer interactions made to secure around a common set of requirements. And the Identity Council, which is one of our working committees, really serves as a focal point for the Alliance's identity and identity-related efforts, leveraging embedded chip technology and privacy-enhancing security software, and we support a whole wide spectrum of both physical and logical use cases and applications. We also are addressing multiple form factors such as cards and token devices, as well as mobile devices in the implementation of these secure identity and authentication solutions. Some of the specific areas that the Identity Council has provided are shown on the right side there in terms of some white papers, frequently asked questions documents, webinars, and conference events, and they'll be available for you to look at after the webinar, and we encourage you to view those other resources at your convenience. We can go to the next slide, please. So one of those efforts that we've done to provide more information and education in the marketplace is the development of the web information portal called mdlconnection.com. And this has been developed under the direction of the Identity Council and the Mobile Driver's License Initiative. And it's increased in both member engagement and importance for the betterment of digital identification and the use of mobile technologies to address market needs in a number of different usage models. And so the initiative has been driven primarily by the industry stakeholders involved. It's focused purely around education and information sharing, and it's a place where we can deposit white papers and documents, including those that are sourced from other organizations and other industry groups. And it's an online resource that includes a knowledge center, a breakdown of multiple mobile driver's license uses, and an implementation map that shows where across the United States there is progress being made at the state level to introduce either pilots or rollouts of mobile driver's licenses. There's also a section there about how to get involved. So if you are new to the organization and to this effort and you want to have your industry organization participating in this, we would encourage you to reach out to us and get involved. If we can go to the next slide, please. So with that introduction about the Alliance and the Identity Council, let me introduce today's panels for the webinar. We'll begin with David Keltz, who's Director of Product Development for Mobile ID at Get Group North America. And David leads Get Group's Mobile ID development efforts and has spent the last 5 years bringing the trustworthy mobile driver's license to life through his work in the ISO 18013-5 working group and several mobile driver's license pilots. We also have Mindy Stevens from AMVA, and she's the Manager of Identity Management at AMVA for the last year and a half. She has become more involved with biometric standards and the 1949-1968 road traffic safety conventions. And Mindy has 15 years of industry experience, 6 of which have been with the AMVA organization. And Mindy will be joined by Lafi Jordan from AMVA. And Lafi is the business solutions architect. And he currently works on mobile driver's licenses, on systems helping the many U.S. issuers ensure that a person has only one driver's license, and on related mobile driver's license initiatives. We also have Arjan Gelik from UL, and he's the lead principal advisor for identity management and security with UL, and task force leader for the mobile driver's license standardization effort with ISO, and a special technical advisor for mobile driver's licenses towards AMVA. And we also have Tom Lockwood, is the Identity and Security Manager at NextGen ID. He's also the chair of the Secure Technology Alliance Identity Council and has led this mobile driver's license project team with the Secure Technology Alliance. So if we can go to the next slide, I'm now going to hand things off to our first presenter, David Keltz from Get Group North America. David?
Thank you, Randy. You can go ahead to the next slide, Kathy. So when you discuss challenges, you can always run the risk of coming off as a critic or coming off negative. And I want to be sure the context is set well for everything that everybody's going to talk about today. All the people here, plus the 200 or so people that have registered in our online, have a stake in how this ecosystem builds out. And so we want to discuss now today some of the things that are challenges some of the things we know we need to work on together through STA and through many other channels in order to build a robust, trustworthy mDL ecosystem. You can go ahead to the next slide. In webinar 1, we talked about how cryptographic proof of identity, and we talked about the mechanisms that are supported in the ISO 18013-5 standard to create trust. Webinar 2, we discussed how these different technologies come together to create interaction modes. And given those interaction modes, how you as relying parties, verifiers, consumers of the mDL, how you can create your use cases. Go ahead to the next slide. And then what we were describing, of course, was ISO 18013, which you can see as one of the building blocks here for trust in this ecosystem. We used this slide in webinar 2, describing the trust that needs to be built in order for this ecosystem to work well from all different participants' viewpoints. So ISO 18013-5 makes it simple to obtain and trust the data. And then webinar 3, we spent a lot of time on what are some of the privacy considerations, privacy requirements, how mDL currently can fulfill those, and what's left to build. So you can go ahead and click to the next one. So now we're going to talk about these other building blocks. And so these challenges are ways that we can build some of these other things that are still necessary in order for the widespread ecosystem to come together, for mDLs to be well trusted, in high circulation, and accepted everywhere. So you'll see that each of the topics today kind of relates to these 3 areas. Go ahead and click to the next one. Really quickly, I'm just going to go back to the trust mechanisms, because then this also highlights some of the other challenges we'll get to today. The issuing authority signs each individual data element of the mDL holder and moves it to the citizen device. That is your mobile driver's license. Click next. At the same time, they're going to circulate their public key widely. Go ahead, click next. And those can be circulated in what's called a master list. So these are lists that somebody knows are good keys. And the ISO 18013-5 standard is for sending tokens and getting the data across. Go ahead and click again, so that verifiers can look at the data. So some of what Ariane's going to talk about today relates exactly to the different legs of this stool and how we can certify and test these. So all of this was to give you an idea of the context of why we want to talk about these challenges, because we know they're necessary to build the full trust in this ecosystem as we go forward. I'm going to hand it over to Mindy Stevens from AMVA and Lafi Jordan to cover the next section.
As they said, I'm Mindy Stevens from AMVA. Very excited to be here with you today to talk to you about mDL. What Lafi and I will be covering with you guys today is the existing trust model that exists with physical credentials, as far as what's in place and the standards that are available. We'll also be talking about the vision for mobile driver license that we see fit. So we'll start off with the physical credentials. So today there's a trust model that exists with the verifier community in credentials that come from the legitimate issuing authority from the jurisdictions in the US and Canada. So this trust model is less of the verifier knowing exactly what each jurisdiction's process is and making a decision based off of that, and more just having trust in knowing that the product came from a reliable issuing authority and having trust that they have good processes in place. The documents from the issuing authorities are generally accepted, even with little education or tools to be able to determine a genuine from a non-genuine certificate. So depending, of course, on what the risk is for the verifier party, and more often than not, whatever credential or documents accepted to the verifier is generally accepted as a proof of ID for that individual. Their confidence still exists, albeit the thousands of counterfeits that are in rotation daily that are being used for several different people for several different reasons. Again, the verifier community or the relying parties still have huge confidence in the products that are presented to them that they use as far as identity for their services. And that is just the reality of the situation. So it's not a perfect system. Obviously, there's always room for improvement, but it is what we have today. And for the most part, obviously does seem to be working. So how do we strengthen this? In 2008, the Department of Homeland Security issued the Real ID Act, which establishes minimum standards for driver licenses and ID cards that will be used for federal purposes. Many jurisdictions are, in fact, have implemented Real ID solutions in their states, but DHS has pushed out their compliance date for when these cards need to be accepted through 2021 as a result of the pandemic. The Real ID Act basically in the requirements or the standards it's established has rules around the documents that can be accepted as a proofing and vetting process prior to the Real ID being issued, and some of those standard issuance processes as far as like when the photo needs to be taken, those types of things. There are, of course, documents that each jurisdiction may issue that's not a Real ID document, and the Real ID standards, of course, don't apply to those documents. These documents are still being used in a lot of non-federal cases as proof of identity with the verifier community today and are accepted. But having said that, the Real ID standards have significantly improved the landscape for the proofing and vetting processes for jurisdictions and helping to strengthen that trust between the verifier community and the issuing authorities. So what is the vision for mobile driver license? So we envision somewhat of the same thing. What we'd like to see is that trust I talked about before being maintained from the verifier community to the issuing authorities. So again, without the issuing authorities knowing exactly what the jurisdiction or the issuing authorities processes for how they provisioned and what documents they accepted, those types of things, to be able to know that the mDL coming from the jurisdiction is trustable because it's coming from the jurisdiction. So that trust framework and that confidence in the issuing authority should not change with the move to mobile. There are, of course, going to be vulnerabilities, just like we talked about with the physical credentials. There's a potential for counterfeit products and for fakes to come across your table. But with the mobile driver license solution, we are looking at a better solution, more likely than the physical credentials. So we're definitely no worse off than we are today. If anything, we have a better design and mechanism in place, which Lofi will talk about a little bit more as we move forward. But we're definitely no worse off than we are today, and we're building a stronger, better solution for the products that will be provided to the issuing authorities for use for ID. And just like with the physical credentials, there are standards. The Real ID standards, of course, are being trying to be updated to be able to incorporate mobile driver licenses used for Real ID. There's also standards that have been developed that are close to being cooked with the ISO groups that I'll get into a little bit later in this presentation, I think, with you, that really helps out the ground rules for the interoperability and, again, helping to establish the trust model for the mobile driver licenses. I'm going to now turn it over to my colleague, Lofi Ordon, who's going to go over the next couple of slides with you. Lofi?
Thank you, Mindy. To add on to what Mindy has just said, issuing authorities, by and large, want to do the same thing they do today, even better in the case of an mDL. So our members came to us and said, our credentials, our physical credentials are being accepted almost everywhere as identity documents. What should we be doing so that the same will be true for the mobile credentials that we issue? So to answer that question, AMBA and the mDL working group that consists of jurisdictional representatives are in the process of compiling requirements and or best practices that would help jurisdictions to answer those questions. Next. Those areas would cover, among other things, like your app security features. Next. What you could do to protect the data, both while on the app or while it's being handled by an intermediary. And next, what you should be doing on the side of provisioning your mDL to make sure that you have a solid solution. Our intent is coming up with these guidelines to make use of existing standards and or practices as much as possible. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, and to provide a full suite of references to our members. We envision that eventually, with the necessary stakeholder input, this would become a good baseline for Real ID compliance, and by extension to the issuance of non-Real ID credentials as well. So that's the one side of how we're helping issuing authorities to make sure that they can be in a position to issue trustworthy products. When it comes to verifying that a document that I'm working with, we work in what we call the trust model, which is on the next slide. So AMVA is currently investigating different public key administration models. In order to authenticate an mDL, you need to authenticate using a public key of the issuing authority, and you need to trust that it actually came from the issuing authority. And so the challenge is that you have many issuing authorities and you have many verifiers. And what we're looking at is how can we set up, what's the best solution for public key administrator? And once we know that, we can see how can we set that up. And so next illustrates the problem by saying that you have many public certificates that you use to get to a public key administrator. And that public key administrator has the function of next determining what the origin is, next that the quality is good, and next would want to disseminate the public certificates to the verifiers. As I've said, AMVA is in the process of investigating what solutions there are to this challenge and what the best one would be. And as a shameless plug, we are issuing an RFI in this area later this year, and if anyone's interested, we'd encourage you to participate in that endeavor. Thank you.
While that's starting up, so I'm going to talk about some of the risks, some of the risks ahead of us, some of the issues ahead of us towards building an mDL ecosystem. Go ahead to the next slide. These are all outlined in Section 6 of the white paper on the STA website and available from mdlconnection.com. That white paper lists, I think it's 11 different risks and challenges to the ecosystem. I'm going to just talk about 2 of them myself, and then the others are covering the other 11. So these are also opportunities for us to kickstart a really robust mDL ecosystem to make things really work widely. When you look at the one factor that will most ensure consumers adopt this, it's that if this is accepted everywhere, they know they can walk with their card today and use it anywhere they need to present ID. And that needs to be true of mDL as well. And I'll discuss some of the things that are challenges, some of the things you need to jump over to get to that point. And they fit into really kind of 2 frameworks. One is having really robust interaction modes so that verifiers choose to go ahead and accept mDLs, and that also that that verifiers choose to accept them in ways that fit their business and expand their business opportunities or expand the way that they accept mDLs. And then the other is sort of what the market forces are behind the start off of this ecosystem, because it could start slowly or it could start really quickly and roll really quickly. So both of these are things we can work on in STA to help these forces. Go ahead to the next one. So looking at that, the full-featured rollout, essentially looking at the ability of mDLs to support multiple different interaction modes. If you just take a quick look at first blush at how you think some of these verifiers may want to accept an mDL. In a restaurant, it would work really well for the waiter to walk up, scan over your shoulder with a QR code, go to Bluetooth or go to a quick online request to the issuing authority and pull the data. This can work really well, works well within the flow of that particular interaction. TSA has, and we heard in webinar, I believe 2 and 3 about TSA, how TSA is looking at accepting this, and they very much want to start with offline transactions with an NFC tap, and then moving to something like Wi-Fi Aware for the data transfer. So they want to do that offline. If you look at a supermarket, right now in many supermarkets, you walk in and there's a plexiglass window. You see a sign there, which may be hard to read, but it's like, please, consider using contactless payments, because we don't want cards to change hands any longer. So using that NFC device that you see there seems logical first step for supermarkets, or any market that sells an age-restricted product. And of course, roadside stop, where you've got a distance, and safety security measures may have that officer want to make a distance connection. So there's a variety of ways in which verifiers will want to accept the MDLs. If MDL solutions come out and only support one of those, then verifiers may say, okay, well, I can change my business process a little, and I'll do that. That can be really helpful jumpstarting the ecosystem. Or they might say no, and that would be a deterrent to jumpstarting this ecosystem. So how do we ensure that MDL solutions have a full set of interaction modes? And how do we know that verifiers can accept it in multiple ways? And these two things will come together. You can go to the next slide. Can come together to make for the environment where they're accepted everywhere, and that accepted everywhere will trigger the success of this ecosystem. So how can we as STA work together to make sure that this rich MDL ecosystem builds quickly and builds in a good time frame and meets consumer demand? So issuers are providing a civic service. They do today. They know that these identity cards are used, that we use our cards as identity cards, and I think we have to be respectful of that and see what their role is and really understand their role and treat that role with respect. If we engage with issuers and verifiers really early, and we get the conversation going with all the parties, issuers, verifiers, consumers as well, we can be listening to needs, establish some early adopters. I think this is one of the key things that can happen through STA working groups, is to reach verifiers now, educate them, and pull them in so that we are working together to build this ecosystem. The concept of expanding choice to support multiple different workflows in a business is also possible. And then also the selecting MDLs that support multiple interaction modes is what I mentioned on this. So how do we educate enough that balance is well known, that the interaction modes are well known, and the decision makers are choosing those. And in some cases, I'll call out Florida that had an RFP, for example, there will be multiple MDL solutions available to the residents of that state. And so residents get to choose, and they can make their choices as well, and they'll end up choosing the one that is accepted everywhere. So again, I think through STA, through the Identity Council, we can start to make these connections and start to get that message out about a full ecosystem. Go ahead to the next slide. The other thing that's interesting here is we're really pulling together a marketplace in that, where one kind of doesn't exist now. The consumer has the demand, and they may not adopt until they know where they can use their MDL. This is a possibility. And at the same time, verifiers may not adopt until they see a significant number of MDLs. So I think we've always described this as two mountains that are being scaled in order to everyone meet at the lake in the middle. And this is definitely a challenge. How can we find ways that jumpstart this, that pull together those early adopters, publicize use cases really well, and start to get over that initial hurdle to build the marketplace for this? So some of the things we need are these challenges for issuers and verifiers to express their needs. I mean, card standards have worked well for verifiers to lower the risk. They hold the identity risk. They are the ones who need to be in compliance. They're the ones who have a transaction of some value for which they need identity to meet the risk of that value. So card standards have done well to lower that risk and to even distance the need. The issuers say, oh, I do the card standard, and then the verifiers accept that card standard. Same thing here with ISO 18013-5. The issuers can use that standard knowing that verifiers will accept that standard. And that's a key piece of this, is taking those card standards and making sure that they are used to help pull that marketplace together. Also, the interoperability of that standard, me being able to take my mDL and go to multiple different interactions, multiple different businesses, and use it across them because the standard exists, that also kind of lowers the hurdle. And so there's sort of these two sets of demands that are there, and the ability for everyone to be listening to what those demands are, to jump early, to take action, and kind of pull this marketplace together. It's one of the key challenges that we have. Go ahead and click next. Great. So I think as Secure Tech Alliance, we have the ability to play one of the many roles in helping to solve these challenges. We have the verifiers, aligned parties. We have groups of those. We can pull those groups together. We can build the channels so that everybody can hear what what is needed. Possibly that we could create incentives to start early. I don't think that those incentives really sort of exist yet, but there may be, and they could be, perhaps there's publicity incentives or marketing incentives. We could work to make legislative incentives for them to go. So, and we want to make sure that all citizens have access to these solutions. We can't be leaving anybody out, since we don't leave people out with the ID cards, and we can't with the mobile as well. We have to make sure that all citizens are supported. And really, right now, this is so early that these webinars have been great for educating amongst a small group, but we now need to take that and how do we go and educate a much wider audience so that consumers know what's about to happen, why this is trustworthy, so that verifiers can know, so that we get some trigger of large-scale adoption. So I think education also becomes a little bit of an incentive to building this marketplace. And how do we create the need or fulfill the need for lots of different interactions and options? So right now, I think the main driving force in this mDL ecosystem has become the fact that we all want healthier and safer transactions and distance transactions. So that distance, which you don't have as well with an ID card, is something that you can achieve with an mDL, and that's become one of the driving factors. However, these other things listed here, I think we need to build as incentives or as reasons to sort of make the jump and start to move forward. I think that describes the two challenges and how we can work together in STA, to meet them. I think I'm turning it over to Arjan as well. We can go ahead to the next slide. And he's going to talk about testing and certification and how that meets some of these challenges.
Thank you, David, and good afternoon. Next slide, please. In webinar 3, we had a look at the developments leading up to the standardization of mobile driver's license and the role that testing already played over the last 5+ years through testing of ideas and proving technical concepts. Also, we vetted draft versions of the ISO 18013-5 standard, the international standard for mobile driver's license, in a series of mDL test events that were endorsed by AMVA, Ostrootz, and EREG, coordinated by UL and participated by a good representation of the industry. Next slide, please. We looked how testing and certification can play a role in conveying trust between stakeholders in the mDL ecosystem, and we presented a case study how the state of Iowa addressed testing, including conformity assessment and security evaluation. I'm not going into the details of that today. If you haven't had a chance to attend webinar 3, you may want to view the recording that is available from the STA website. Next slide, please. Last time, I ended my presentation with a quote from Melissa Gillette, Director Motor Vehicle Division of the Iowa DOT. Today, against the background of what Mindy, Lofi, and David just presented, I would like to explore the suggestion of an mDL assurance program and how that may address our main challenge towards rollout, jointly achieving the shared goal of trustable, interoperable mDL solutions. Next slide, please. I'm glad that Lofi mentioned a role of a public key administrator that would set minimum requirements that need to be fulfilled before an issuing authority CA certificate can be included in a trusted master list. Next. We strongly suggest working towards a set of common issuing authority policy, process, and technology requirements. We believe that testing and certification in the context of an mDL assurance program could be instrumental to obtaining assurance that these requirements are met and in conveying evidence of that assurance. Let's have a look at some key areas which will likely be addressed: the public key infrastructure, the provisioning process, and the mDL app. Next. To start with the latter, mDL apps need to function properly and be interoperable with mDL reader implementations that conform to ISO 18013 Part 5. mDLs need to be properly secured to protect against unauthorized use or identity theft, and privacy-enhancing technology needs to be implemented to give the mDL holder full control over their data and to enforce that only data is being shared that the holder consents to. To obtain assurance that these objectives are met, an mDL assurance program may provide privacy review, cybersecurity evaluation, and conformity assessment against ISO 18013 Part 5. Next. To look at the provisioning process and PKI, let's zoom in into some key functions in the issuing authority infrastructure. Next. First of all, we have the system of record, which is the source of truth when it comes to the holder's identity information. The identity information that is in the system of record is the result of an enrollment process which may be related compliant and in which the necessary identity assurance processes have been implemented, potentially according to standards like NIST SP 863. Next. The issuing authority PKI is as important as the system of record when it comes to trusting an mDL. The issuing authority's electronic signature is placed on the mDL data that is provisioned to an mDL. That electronic signature, which is created with the issuing authority's private key, provides proof of origin, integrity, and authenticity of the mDL. Control of that private key enables signing on behalf of the issuing authority. That private key should be, therefore, one of the best kept secrets in a state or province. The corresponding public key is made available in the issuing authority's public key certificate. The issuing authority CA certificate is used by an mDL reader to verify the electronic signature on the mDL data to confirm that the mDL is authentic and originates from the issuing authority. Without that certificate, an mDL cannot be authenticated. The issuing authority CA public key certificate should therefore belong to the most prominently published information within the issuing jurisdiction and far beyond. The requirements for protection of the issuing authority CA private key and conditions for its use are laid down in a certificate policy and certification practice statement. Typically, there are requirements for private keys to be stored in a hardware security module, requirements for physical and logical access to the issuing authority CA system, and the hardware security module for key management, etc. In short, requirements for people, process, and technology involved in PKI operations. Next. In the data preparation and document signing function, a driving license holder's information from the system of record is structured into an ISO 18013 Part 5 compliant data structure. This is combined with some information from the mDL app and then electronically signed to establish trust in the data. Next. Credential management is a function where processes for enrollment and user identification, mDL app and device discovery, and the actual provisioning takes place, and where the digital credential status is maintained. This function is essential in the process of tying the mDL holder, their record in the system, the app, and the mobile device together, and to ensure that the right set of data ends up on the right mobile device. If the processes in these 4 key functions are correctly implemented and the protocols for interaction between those functions and the mDL are well protected and secure, an mDL can become as trustworthy as a biometric passport. Next. To obtain assurance that an issuing authority's mDL implementation indeed is highly trustworthy, a number of assurance activities can be carried out. During a PKI audit, processes and technology can be reviewed and confirmed to implement the requirements and meet the objectives laid down in the certificate policy and certification practice statement. Cybersecurity assessment and penetration tests can provide assurance that the issuing authority infrastructure is reasonably secured and protected from unauthorized use. ISO 18013 Part 5 conformity assessment on the mDL data structures and PKI certificate formats provides the assurance that the data preparation and document signing function produces data sets that can be universally interpreted by compliant mDL readers and so contribute to achieving the objective of global interoperability. Next. Within the context of an mDL assurance program, an issuing authority can collect evidence from the various assurance activities. With the necessary test reports and certificates, the issuing authority can demonstrate to the public key administrator that their processes and technology fulfill the applicable policies and requirements. Upon confirmation of that compliance, the issuing authority CA certificate should be admitted on the master list, which can be used by mDL verifiers and relying parties in their mDL readers to confidently accept trusted and interoperable mDLs. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask in the Q&A. I already saw some very good questions come in, or to reach out by email. Thanks very much. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tom Lockwood, and I am the chair of the effort. And what I want to walk through is just an overview of the activities and looking into the future. So for us, next slide, please. What we on the Identity Council really have, the tools in our toolbox are the activities that we have. Yes, we look at mDL, but we also look at other things. We support the Access Council. We work with other industry councils as well. We have a number of activities with the federal government, but I want to talk to you specifically about the efforts on mDL and some of the pieces that you've seen today and where we're walking into the future. Some of the key things like today's webinar: how do we raise awareness? How do we provide education? How do we start initial coordination? How do we really focus on those relying parties themselves? How do we start looking at the needs of relying parties and others? Okay. And again, what are some of the key challenges to adoption so that we as a greater community can go forward? So next slide. We've organized ourselves and we've grown over time essentially to a group that includes really characteristics of two different pieces. One, the capability providers, those people that provide the end-to-end capability for the consumers, for the market space. Okay. And the other piece of this is the relying parties working hand in hand, whether they're merchants, the transportation community, the health community, others. How do others look at this? How do they consider adoption as relying parties? What are the investments? What's the challenges going forward? So in some cases, you're going to see on the capability providers, we're working very closely with AMVA and the state issuers. We have those that make the products, those that are actually the service providers. And then again, when we look over at some of the relying parties, whether that a relying party might be someone like TSA, or when we're looking at the healthcare community and others, how do we start really understanding the needs of people? So this is how we've organized. Again, for those that are relying parties listening, I want to talk directly about how you might participate in the future. Next slide, please. In the initial activities that we've done a strong white paper about both the mDL, the ecosystem, the strengths, the values. For those that haven't seen the white paper, I encourage you to look at it. It's available online. It's a very strong white paper. It says, here's where we are, where we're going. Here's where we're at. Here's some things that we need to address as a community, and hopefully you're picking up some of those today. Again, David laid out the path of the webinars that you're hearing today. And the next one that you'll hear is probably in December. And again, this is starting to go into the discussions of how, as a relying party, do you start thinking about consuming mDLs that have been issued by another state? Okay, so that should be a really great discussion. I'd ask you to keep an eye out for that, because again, part of this is we have a very dynamic environment. We have a very distributed environment. So how do we start planning that discussion between issuers, the people that provide the capabilities, and the relying parties? So that discussion will take place in December. Next slide, please. So when we talk about relying party focused activities, so we worked with the Alliance's chapter organization, the U.S. Payments Forum. Again, that represents all the major retailers. They look at merchants and retail communities, the rule sets that they have, what their preferences are, deep understanding of that community. So again, it gives us the ability to understand what key issues might be for the community, what the priorities are. As we talk over for transportation, if you've listened to some of the earlier webinars, TSA is an early relying party, and as they're thinking about things like use cases of bag drop, bag pickup, in addition to some of the screening. As we talk to the airports, how do the airports start thinking about this as well? So as we walk through different communities, okay, the healthcare community is working pilots on this, looking at everything from the pharma and the clinic side over to procurements as well. On the federal side, again, you will be from the Real ID Act and Real ID Act compliance. The federal government needs to check the document that you present, whether it's a standard card, driver's license, or an mDL, does it meet Real ID? Again, another customer in this discussion. State and local governments, they consume driver's licenses as a matter of course. Again, certainly the law enforcement community, okay, but also other communities. Again, the food and beverage community, you saw that in one of David's presentations before. Okay, next slide, please. So when we talk about the guidance that needs to take place, what is it you as a relying party that has an enterprise, what are the key issues? What is it really required to make a decision on your side about a change in enterprise operations? So again, part of this is relying parties need to know. In some case, for a group like NASIO, who really looks at all of the states in coordination with the states and really between the IT leaders in the state, how would they consume an mDL? This is a primary benefit, and it really helps the launch of the ecosystem. Next slide, please. So as we're looking forward, in the white paper, we've seen areas that we can prioritize on and work together looking in the future. One of the key things that I'm asking everyone that's part of the webinar and those that listen into the future is, how do you want to participate? There's room for everybody. This is very, very big. As we look at this, there's efforts that UL will be leading on the test and certification side. There's activities that AMVA really does want your participation and support. We have relying parties that really need to understand how, as a community of relying parties, whether that's the aviation sector or the law enforcement sector, what's the key dependencies? If we just talk about the law enforcement community themselves, they have 14 different use cases. And you would say, well, how does this integrate with e-ticketing? How does this integrate in with driver's license readers? If we're talking on the healthcare side, one of the things that you would say is, well, how does this integrate with the pharma operations, the clinic operations? Okay. On the health services side, some of the questions that people are looking at is an mDL in addition identities are available. How will that support better health services and health delivery? So there is a lot of activities that are starting in parallel. When we talk about jump-starting the ecosystem, no one will really see value if they only look at a single relying party. So some of the strategies that we're looking at is, how do we bring multiple relying parties together so that the user experience is richer, where it really makes sense for somebody to consider buying an mDL, because there'll be certain numbers of relying parties that are ready to work together. If the individual consumers get value, and if the relying parties get value, part of the coordination is can we discount? Can we incentivize? How might we do that? That was raised earlier in the discussion. So one of the first communities that you'll see some level of density, some level of commitment around various relying parties will probably be the aviation community. But for those that are on the line, one of the questions that I would ask is, how would you start driving this within your communities, because there's just so much value? Next slide, please. So the ask that we really want people to consider is, first, let's support the overall awareness and education of the ISO-based standard. Okay, the standard should be complete by the end of the year. It should be published early next year. We'll have a final standard. Okay, how do we think about an mDL? Well, just think about right off the bat, where do you consume a driver's license? And already knowing that an mDL can reduce cost, reduce risk. It provides a much better quality of service and life, user experience. That's going to drive us into this touch-free experience in itself. Okay, so again, on these things, please consider. If you have working groups now, think about the discussion in your working group. Think about how we might work and collaborate together. And lastly, if we collaborate, whether you're the rental car community, which we're collaborating with, or the National Notaries Association, or other groups, how might you want to have representatives part of our team that are taking place within the core group, so that they're getting a more holistic understanding of what's going on, how they can look at, if you would, people that have same problem, different problem set. So we encourage you, again, to participate looking into the future. So with that, I thank you for the time. Randy?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Thank you, audience. This has been a great presentation today, and we have a few more minutes left for Q&A. Just before we get to those Q&A questions, I just wanted to highlight a couple of new resources to make you aware of. If you can go to the next slide, please. So, one of those resources that we've been talking about is the mDL webinar series and use cases recordings that we have, and we encourage you to go back and listen to those, that in case you weren't on those original webinar sessions we've had over the last few months. Also, the white paper that Tom is referring to is available on the STA website. We encourage you to visit that, as well as look at the Knowledge Center and some resources by AMVA And if you're really into the technology, the draft international standards are available for you to view on the link that we've provided here. If we can go to the next slide, please. So I'll leave this contact information up for any of you who want to contact us after the event, but we'll have just a few minutes to take a couple of questions here. First question I'd like to ask the audience or the panelists is about the mDL token for verification. Is it static or is it dynamic? Someone mentioned that it's stored, they store the token on the device. Can that token be used again later if it's already been stored on the device? Can anyone answer that question?
Yeah, in fact, no, it can't. It's a one-time use token, and so that you wouldn't be able to have those sort of replay attacks. And there's encryption as well. That's one-time use encryption.
Okay, thank you, David. We got a question about the healthcare use case and the importance for MDLs to potentially supplement what we use for physical driver's licenses. So, Tom, is there any publicly available information on the healthcare sector use for mobile driver's licenses you can share?
That is a great hook for a presentation that we're proposing in the immediate near future. Again, we're collaborating with the relying parties, and we are hoping to lay out a timeline to give you a presentation within the next 60 days or so on the healthcare side and on the MDL. Okay?
Excellent. There is a question here that I'll answer. How does the SDA support the advancement of state, local, and federal legislation to drive mobile driver's license adoption? You heard from Mindy and Lafi from AMVA that they are actively involved in some of the standards efforts and working with the states on this, but I want to be clear that the Secure Technology Alliance does not have in its mission to do any lobbying work or any involvement with specific state, local, or federal legislation. And how it might apply to mobile driver's license adoption. But we would look to those other organizations that do support those types of efforts, and we'll certainly provide industry input into any of that if we're asked to provide that type of input. I think we've got one more question here. Some of the questions were answered in the chat box before. Let's see. Question about, are there existing laws that will help with the chicken egg situation that David, you alluded to in terms of having the issuing organizations and consumers trust the mDL and having verifiers be able to utilize the technology? You're on mute, David. Can you answer that?
So I don't think I can characterize existing legislation. However, I know a lot of states have looked at and figure that they have acceptable credentials now and their signature is valid on these. So I don't know that I can answer a question about what the state of legislation is.
Mindy or Lafi, do you have any knowledge about the state of legislation you could share on that?
So different states are in various places. We find that as states embark on this endeavor, they typically do consider their legislation as well. And you'll find that states that are further down the road have typically already adapted their legislation to allow support of an mDL. So it's an ongoing process and one that we see playing out successfully in the end.
Great, thank you. Well, it looks like we are at the top of the hour here, so I want to thank all of our presenters today and the people behind the scenes from the Identity Council and the project team for helping out with today's webinar. Here's our contact information. If you'd like to follow up with us, you can do so. A reminder that we have recorded today's webinar. It'll be available for playback after the webinar is concluded. And you'll receive an email with a link where you can access that recording. We would encourage you to share that link with others in your organization or other colleagues you have in the industry who may not have been able to participate today, so more can have access to this information. Thank you again for your attention. This concludes today's webinar, and have a great day.